So welcome to our panel discussion on the new customized approach, which, as we've told you, is the new method in version 4 for implementing and validating security controls. So as you know, I'm Lauren Holloway, and I've been with the standard for quite a few years now. And I have with me today other members of the council to talk with you about the customized approach. We have Brandy Cumberland, who has been steering the assessor quality management function for several years, and she's here to help align expectations about quality and the assessor's role. We also have Marc Bayerkohler and Tom White. Between providing and developing PCI training and the previous work that they've done on the ground, they're here to offer their insights to help organizations that might be considering the customized approach. So let's start with a little bit of background information on what customized approach is. And for that, for that I will start with a question for me. What is a customized approach and how does it fit into version 4? So there are two approaches now for implementing and validating PCI DSS requirements. There's the defined approach, which is the traditional method. It's what everybody's doing now. And you implement the security controls that are defined in the standard, and then the assessor follows the defined testing procedures to determine whether those controls are met. If an organization already has their controls in place and is comfortable with the way those controls are being met, there's no need to change. There's no requirement to do the customized approach. The defined approach is also good for those who might be looking for a specific direction on how to meet a requirement, including those who may be new to PCI DSS or information security. Now, the customized approach focuses on the customized approach objective, which we've added new into version 4. The organization defines its own controls to meet that stated objective, and then the assessor has to create or derive their testing procedures to verify that the control is working properly. Now, the customized approach provides organizations with more flexibility so that they can maybe use new technologies or different processes that may not fit within the defined approach, pardon me, may not fit within the defined approach. And it's important to point out the customized approach is initially going to take more effort than the defined approach. So let's start with a question for Tom. Tom, what about compensating controls? Can we still use those?
Ooh, yeah, that sounds a bit like a top 10 question. But yeah, compensated controls can still be used with the defined approach in a PCI DSS version 4 assessment. So Lauren said that the defined approach is like the old one that we would always do for PCI DSS version 3.2.1 and before. To use a compensated control, we've still got to have that technical or business constraint, and then an entity can build their control on top of that to mitigate the risk of not meeting the requirement that they can't meet. The assessor still documents all of that in the compensated control worksheet.
So I know, Tom, a lot of people think these two sound alike, that compensating controls and customized approach, they're kind of two ways to say the same thing. Could you explain the difference between them?
Yeah, so customized approach isn't about having a constraint. It's about building robust, secure controls that meet the customized approach objective, right? Now, customized approach objectives are generally broader and less prescriptive than the defined approach requirement. And again, Lauren said that nobody's being forced to do any of this. Entities can choose to follow the defined approach, or they can choose to build controls that meet the customized approach objective. The documentation is quite different. So I mentioned that an assessor still has to complete the compensating control worksheet. Well, all of the documentation that an entity and an assessor have to do for the customized approach is kind of a lot more than that. One thing, I have said that compensating controls can still be used for version 4 assessments. But, Brandy, I think you had a scenario where that's not true.
Yeah, so you can't use a compensating control within the customized validation, and it goes back to what you were just talking about. If there's no constraint, then you shouldn't have a compensating control.
Yeah, so those things are kind of mutually exclusive. But you can use the defined approach, perhaps with a compensating control, and the customized approach on the same requirement, to meet the same requirement, just as long as you're using those two different approaches on different systems. So maybe compensating controls on a legacy system, and then the customized approach on a newly built, robust, and secure system.
So I have a question now for Marc. Since we're hopefully on the same page now about the customized approach, who decides if an organization is going to do a customized approach?
Yeah, I can think of 3 organizations that might take part in that kind of decision. To begin with, the entity under assessment, of course, they are going to decide, they're going to look at the customized approach and decide, is this right for us? Because as Tom said, no one's going to force anyone to use the customized approach, and so many organizations might just continue on with the defined approach. And then also there's the assessor, because the assessor has a role in evaluating the customized control. They're going to be the ones that decide, does it meet the objective and is it effective? So that will be part of it. But then finally, the report receiving entities also could be involved with that, because of course in any manner of compliance, they have the final say in what it is that they are going to accept or not.
All right, thanks for that. Marc, I'll follow up also with you on this one. What types of organizations are most likely to be suited to do a customized approach?
Yeah, when I think of an organization that's well suited for the customized approach, I think of an organization that has a very mature risk management system, that they're very comfortable with creating new controls and evaluating risk. Like they're very comfortable doing risk assessments. But in addition to those skills, I think of an organization that has really taken ownership for their own compliance, right? This isn't an organization that waits around once a year for an assessor to come in and do compliance to them. This is an organization that has internalized their own responsibility for their compliance.
Well, and I'll build on that. You know, PCI DSS has always been about that 24/7, 365 compliance. But if you do this approach, you're taking that to another level of responsibility. And so, you know, I would note that in addition to being risk mature, you also may want to have folks like ISAs on board, folks that can help you, you know, monitor what is going on over the course of the year, so that when the assessor comes to do compliance to you, you're ready to go.
So, Marc, stick with you for just one more question. What is the entity's role with the customized approach?
When an entity decides that they want to do the customized approach, they're taking on a lot of extra activities that they're going to have to be performing. But I also want to point out that most of these activities happen long before the assessment itself, and they're done by the entity before the assessment, not in reaction to it. But of course, they're going to be doing things like designing, creating controls, monitoring controls, evaluating these controls. Those are all steps they're going to be taking. And in addition, of course, there's a lot of documentation that goes along with that. Our policies and procedures, of course, but also documentation and, pardon me, and maintenance of all of the evidence of all of that. But there are also some specific forms and paperwork that go along with that. For instance, we have a template for the targeted risk analysis, and that needs to be filled out for each one of the affected requirements. And then there's also the controls matrix, and that's the document where you're going to talk all about your customized control, but not only define the control, but you also explain how does it meet the objective? Is it effective? And I think probably the biggest difference, the testing that's done by the entity itself, in addition to the testing eventually done by the assessor.
And Tom, now, can you describe what the role of the assessor is in a customized approach?
Right. So I mean, obviously, the assessor has to understand the customized approach, and they have to understand how to complete the reporting templates and things. But I think that the kind of the biggest thing is that the assessor and the entity work together to kind of get a mutual understanding of this security control that's going to be used to meet the customized approach. We've got I was just thinking, because Marc, you talked about the different documentation from the entity's point of view. The assessor's got a whole bunch of stuff in the report and compliance template that they need to fill in. And the assessor needs to review all of that documentation that the entity is producing. So that's kind of a big extra step that the assessor has to do before even looking at the control itself, if you see what I mean. The assessor also has another new responsibility in that they have to derive their own testing procedures so that they can check whether the control, so the assessor derives their own testing procedures, and then they use those to test whether the control meets the customized approach objective.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that both the assessor and the entity that's being assessed are both doing some sort of testing. It's not just the assessor here.
Yeah, so once the entity's they're building this control, they're testing the control, the assessor comes in and they're going to review all of that. And so there's a lot of moving parts to this. Now, something that I want to make clear is the stuff that Marc talked about that the entity has to do, that's in Appendix E of PCI DSS. The report on compliance template also has another appendix called Appendix E. So we've got two Appendix E's, but the one in the reporting template is for the assessor, and they're going to use that and complete that as part of the assessment.
So Brandy, we've had organizations asking us if it's okay for an organization to hire a QSA to design their customized approach for them. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
I would love to speak to that, Lauren. I think that's a question that goes to independence, right? And so when the QSA company and the QSA employee are qualified by PCI SSC as QSAs, they have to adhere to the QSA qualification requirements. They have to adhere to the Code of Professional Responsibility. But at the end of the day, the requirement that comes out of that is that an assessor should not be auditing their own work, right? The QSA can absolutely help design the customized approach, but what it comes down to is when it's time to go back and validate those controls, you need a different QSA to do that for you. Something else I would point out is that can you do it? Absolutely. Should you do it? I would think about that for a bit, because if you're at a point as an organization where you want to implement controls like this, but you don't feel comfortable designing it and implementing it yourself, it's going to be a challenge for you to then maintain it over the course of the year, et cetera.
So Brandy, you're not saying that an organization should hire two different assessor companies to help them and do the assessment?
No, not necessarily. Most QSA companies are going to have that separation of duties to make sure that you can have a QSA employee who's designing and implementing, and another QSA employee who is actually validating the controls. But what it really comes down to is it just can't be the same human being.
So Marc, I have a question for you now. Do you think the customized approach is a shortcut to PCI DSS compliance?
Oh, no, far from it. Because by definition, the customized approach is going to take more work and more resources. And we've already talked about how there's a lot of responsibility for making new controls and things, but also now the entity differently is not going to sit around passively and just respond to requests from the assessor for data. They're going to have to proactively create these tests and create this evidence that's going to be used. In addition, we've got all those detailed forms that we talked about that have to be filled out. So although the customized approach can allow an organization to use innovative new controls for great security, I don't think that it's going to end up being easier or less work.
So, Brandy, do you think the customized approach is the right approach if an organization finds out during its assessment that they're not meeting a PCIDSS requirement?
No, absolutely not. No, if you didn't hear that, don't do that. The point of this option is not to, realize reactively, oh no, we didn't meet the requirements as stated, and this is what we're going to do instead. That's not an acceptable use of this. And I guess what I would point out is what we talked about in the last session when I talked about the QSA annual QA questionnaire. We will be asking for samples of this in future questionnaires, and part of that is to monitor that the assessors are, applying it in an equitable way. And so we'll look at those. And if we see abuse of that, if we see folks doing that sort of thing, that's something that we're going to see as a quality issue. And so that could result in actions like remediation or even revocation. What I would say is, could you implement a customized approach during an assessment? Sure, maybe. But the whole point is that, based on what Marc and Tom just talked about, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So, if you wait till that point, you're really going to significantly delay your assessment.
All right, thanks, Brandy. And now I have a last question for each panelist. It's the same question. What is your one recommendation for organizations that are looking at the customized approach for the first time and wondering if it might be the right approach for them? Let's start with you, Brandy.
Yeah, I think folks really need to just understand the roles and responsibilities of the entity versus the QSA and plan accordingly.
And Tom?
Yeah. Well, we've been talking a bit about this, and I just listening to our answers, I don't want people to think that the customized approach isn't cool. Like, it's new and it's cool. I feel like we might have just been a bit like, well, don't do it here, don't do that.
Well, sure, but that means it's appropriate for some people and not for others. Like,
Absolutely.
my kid says stuff like, wow, that's cringe, and I sound really dumb saying that on stage.
Yeah. But anyway, right. Yeah, and it's new, right? So it's cool, but it's new, and that means that we at the council, we're expecting to get feedback and have dialogue about this to see how it's being used out there. So we're kind of ready to respond, because I like to think that we are the community, and I'm pretty sure that we've all probably got something to offer.
You don't seem very confident in that, but I'm confident. I believe in everybody in this room.
So, Marc, what is your answer?
My advice would have to be with communication. If anything, we probably want to over-communicate. So, for instance, with our assessors, right? Because we want to communicate with them early and often, because of course they have a role in this. But remember, as Tom said, like, this is new to them as well, right? So if they're going to have to evaluate an organization doing the customized approach, they might need additional time for planning for that as well. So I would just make sure to try to make sure that you're all on the same page as you go down this journey together.
Well, that's all the questions we have for our panelists today. And I thank you, and I appreciate your time for listening to us. We know this is a new topic, and it's fairly complex as well. And as we just said, customized approach is not the right approach for everyone. Hopefully, we gave you enough information today that you know if your organization should look more closely at customized approach, or maybe you've realized that the defined approach is fine for your organization. Please, if you have questions, come find us in office hours or on the vendor showcase. And thank you.